welcome y'all to today's PSSA. We're going to be going over like an intro into political philosophy, and thankfully we have a special guest, Dr. Montagano, who's going to be giving us a little bit of a spiel, and if you have any questions, you can direct it towards him or Professor Cavalli. But it's more like a discussing of like politics, and like, if you have any questions, great day for it. Thank you all for coming. Also, a little bit later, he'll be passing around an attendance sheet. So.
For those of you that are new here, we meet every Wednesday at noon. You all are welcome, whether you knew about this or not. If you sign the attendance sheet, we will verify your attendance. If you put a faculty name next to it, we will contact that faculty. Can't guarantee they'll do anything about it, but we will let them know that you did attend. So, we have a special guest.
Hi, my name is Dr. Ellie Montagano. You can call me Elliot, it's what my mom calls me. I was invited here to talk to you about, I guess, what political philosophy is. And this is always sort of an interesting question for me because I'm never exactly sure what to say. In some sense, it helps to sort of distinguish it from political science and what exactly that is. But I guess whether you like it or not, you sort of participate in political philosophy almost any time you ask questions about politics. To differentiate, I mean, social science, as you pursue it in a scientific way, doesn't actually have any real value judgments. It's science. It's supposed to discover the truth, to do it in an unerring way, hopefully. But the problem is you're human beings. And in being human beings, you are filled with value judgments. You're filled with moral statements. You're filled with an understanding of what is best or worst. And I guess the question would be principally, why pursue social science at all if you aren't trying to seek some sort of aim that is about what is best, what is highest, what is good, what is justice, what is fair. These are essential kind of qualities and questions to political philosophy. To sort of put it a different way, I mean, if we look way back in the history of ideas, political philosophy actually sought to answer all the questions that political science does now. And the two were not actually separated in any meaningful way. I mean, in some sense, when we talk about political philosophy, we're talking about topics and issues that are covered in like economics or social psychology or sociology for that matter. Political philosophy asks these questions and try to investigate them as well. Obviously, it's been thousands of years and times have changed, and the way we investigate things is rather different. But in some sense, science can only take you so far, and the idea that that's quite all right. And the idea that science does not make value judgments. Why you even pursue social science is primarily an important topic because you have value judgments, because you believe something about the world. In this sense, science can only do a part of that legwork. Right? And it's sort of a funny thing because as you look in political science departments across the United States, and ours is no different, I might be, maybe Dr. Cavalli can confirm this or not, I think I'm the only one that actually is a political theorist of any kind that's not, say, a second field or sort of a subfield. It is a very diminished group in political science programs, and it has been disappearing to some degree one way or another. I guess in part what I would say is that to be an advocate for political philosophy is that political philosophy seeks something that social science, political science doesn't, and that really is a sense of the whole. All philosophy seeks to have knowledge in the nature of all things. Political philosophy obviously is a subset of that. And so we are looking at quintessentially political questions. But there are questions that cannot be answered by social science because you're all human beings. You're kind of a mess. Not you personally, not me personally, but like as people, we are unpredictable. We are only insofar measurable in certain times and places in certain contexts. Even social science tends not to extrapolate or universalize its answers for anything. Political philosophy, though, seeks to know the whole. And this is a remarkably difficult thing to know, to discover, to consider. So usually the follow-up question is like, why bother? Like, why bother with political philosophy at all? Part of its importance is in willingness to ask the questions, to actually try to investigate, because even just knowledge of the question itself is of paramount importance, because it allows us to investigate. It gives us direction. And so in the end, no matter what you believe, think, or feel, right, you are in some way touched upon philosophical questions, and in this sense, particularly philosophical questions of a political variety, whether you're investigating in terms of sociology or social psychology or even economics in some sense. You have to ask what is good, what is best. Even that you have a preferred regime type, maybe you prefer democracy because it's freedom or something, right? It used to be in antiquity, virtue was the highest goal. But to even have this fight or debate, you have to ask what is best. And honestly, social science doesn't care if it's being done in that very scientific, neutral way. But your life matters in relation to value judgments, moral judgments, virtue, freedom, right? These are questions that you have that social science is willing to try to measure in one way or another, but you're very difficult to measure. It also can't have an answer to those questions. That's up to human beings to debate, decide, and just to even suppose that there's something better or worse supposes possibly a highest good, possibly a best way of life. Again, social science really in that end does not care. Political philosophy does, and in doing so it tries to seek the whole of what it means to be human. I don't know, I guess I've advocated for political philosophy enough as is. But I also don't know what I was supposed to say. And I keep on looking at Anita, maybe she'll help me out. But I'd be happy to also sort of hear your questions, talk to you about stuff.
Well, we actually already have one online statement. It's more of a statement than a question. And you might want to address it one way or the other. It says political theories have changed a lot since Socrates. Is that?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I obviously agree with that statement. The way we sort of approach it classically is different from modernity. It's different in post-modernity. It has changed a lot since Socrates, but it's the same kinds of questions, the same sort of investigation. I feel like I'm arguing with an invisible person right now. And in this sense, Socrates didn't claim to know everything. In fact, he claimed to have knowledge of ignorance of the whole, which is why he pursued philosophy in the manner that he did. But that's also why we use him as the model, not the answer to all questions. But the fact that it has changed over time suggests the problem of politics and the purpose of political philosophy. It's not necessarily, and I realize this sounds really annoying to people who study things in a more scientific way, it's not necessarily about having the answer, so we should expect that over time these judgments, these understandings will change. I don't know if the internet is satisfied. But
I think it's like with time, at least, it seems to have a big part of political philosophy. Like it's always evolving. So looking at like Aristotle or Plato when they talk about their definitions of like justice, maybe. I think it was Aristotle. He's like giving this whole spiel about what a just society would look like, but then he's also describing like slaves within the like family. I don't remember what he called it, but family tree of sorts. And it's like obviously we wouldn't say today that having slaves is just or justice. So like I think it's hard for us as political science majors, a lot of us, to like consider that there isn't an answer for that or like a pattern that we can like specifically look to and say like, oh, this is what has changed or why it changed or how long it took to change.
okay, I feel like there are almost two sorts of questions in there somewhere. Not an advocate of slavery. Let's get that one recorded. So things have changed over time, yes. And what is sort of interesting is if we look at in a social science approach, you have to account and measure for those changes in time. In fact, one could ask, if you are studying, say, American government of a particular era under particular systems and institutions, that's about the scope of whatever your answers are going to find, right? Behind that, though, is sort of the big principal questions, and these seem to be moral questions, questions of what justice is. To say that certain errors are wrong could be quite accurate, but then are you implicitly saying our era is correct? Maybe in part, maybe, I'm going to say maybe in part, because I'm not going to say in whole, because if we had an answer to what the whole is, philosophy would be done. We'd problem solved, we don't have to think about that thing anymore. And so, yes, things evolve and change, our understandings evolve and change. At some point, though, we tend to default to value judgments. I'm being very cagey about this because you brought up slavery, which is a rough example. You might as well just brought up the Holocaust and been like, defend that, and I'm like, what am I going to do with that?
My point was more that what you're saying is that it is forever like evolving, and I think that can sometimes make it difficult to study almost.
So I guess the question would be, in the end, do we stop studying it? Do we stop bothering? I mean, I would say no. Because in the end, philosophy is the pursuit of wisdom. It is sort of the erotic pursuit of wisdom, which means there's a little bit of a madness to it, in some sense, because we may not have the answer. We may not have the answer to the whole. And what social science does is to, and what economics and social psychology, sociology all pursue, is parts. And we agree sort of scientifically in the modern scientific project that we can all do our part and measure out those parts. And if we accumulate it all together, maybe we can have an answer, but we don't have an answer of what the whole is yet. And so really, in the end, has it changed over time because we've discovered something of the whole, or are we sort of chipping away at it? I would say it's best we're chipping away at it. But again, we should never stop asking the question. Because again, human beings, the way we pursue the world around us, what is quintessentially human is not so easily measurable. In fact, they may be the most important questions. Mathematics is very clean in a lot of ways. You get answers, you can look at it. In the end, that's only part of what it is to exist. I think the hardest questions we actually ask are in things like political philosophy, which we hope to, once we find or conclude on some sort of value or judgment, science can maybe come to fruition and offer us more of that. Do you like rights? Well, how do we enhance or protect them? What is your sense of justice? How can we ensure more of it? What institutions or structures might provide it? Social science can help in these questions. The problem is, we've already made a value judgment, though, to direct towards it. And so these value judgments may change over time. The goal is, though, possibly to find the truth, whatever that looks like. And yeah, in the face of sort of its uncertainty and its pursuit, it makes it rather discouraging to the point that most people might say, who cares? It's just bloviating or intellectual masturbation of some kind, right? A chuckle from the back row, that's nice. I don't know if that's satisfying of an answer, though, for you.
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily looking for one answer, because I guess that's the whole point, is that we don't really have...
Throw it right back in my face, yep.
It brings to mind, we were talking in class just yesterday, we had sort of a side conversation about how political science has changed in the last 60 some odd years. And my point was that prior to about the mid-1950s, much of political science was this sort of study of institutions and constitutions and rules and regulations and how things function, the machinery, et cetera, almost devoid of the human part. Basically, there wasn't much of a difference if you go back to the first half of the 20th century and into the 19th century. There wasn't much of a difference between political science and legal studies. But in the 1950s, that began to change. And I've talked about this in other classes too. I don't know if any of you have been there when I did, but I talked about sort of the young guns of political science in the 1950s, led by Robert Dahl. And then in presidential studies, we talk about Richard Neustadt, and there are others, Aaron Wildavsky, who brought the human element into it. I learned about it in graduate school as behavioralism, the idea that human behavior matters. It may have something to do with constitutions and institutions and rules and regulations, but human behavior and how humans interact with those institutions and with each other matters a lot. And Richard Neustadt talks about the idea that presidential power is not making use of the constitutional powers that you have per se, it's being able to persuade people, to get them to do things that you think they should be doing. You try to get, you'll learn this later on when you read, he says that the greatest power of the presidency is the power of persuasion, and that is the power to get people to think that what you want is what they want, is what they want too. And it almost makes me think that we're kind of coming full circle back around to bringing the human element into it.
Yeah, I feel like I've spent a little bit of time in attempting to differentiate social science from political philosophy, that I've denigrated social science. That was not my intent. But it is rather interesting to talk about sort of this return of the consideration of what is distinctly human, because that's also the hardest thing to measure. I mean, it's sort of funny. It is, and it makes sense thinking about it in terms of laws and constitutions and institutions, because one can point and look and compare rather easily. There's a lot of sort of discussion in behavioralism that requires like proxies for things, for human action, and proxies are not necessarily a one-to-one. And so measuring human beings is rather difficult in that sense, of which I guess my only real distinction is not that social sciences, we should throw it out because it can't answer any more than the parts, let alone the whole. It's that it loses that vision, and that social science can at least be aided by what we consider to be present-day political philosophy, because again, it's been sort of relegated to the back of the bus, the back of the room. But it used to be the whole of it, of which anything akin to social science was merely a part.
I mean, is there much of a difference between Robert Dahl and, say, Machiavelli?
Wow, I feel like I almost just defended Machiavelli for like no reason. That's a value judgment of mine, or just like a knee-jerk
Well,
reaction.
I'll let you know, I'm a defender of his, but not for the reasons that people think.
Ooh.
I see Machiavelli in a completely different light.
Would you like to?
Well, I mean, most people use the word Machiavellian to mean scheming and power grabbing, et cetera, but I see Machiavelli as an early political scientist who simply said, if you live in a principality, this is what princes should do to stay in power. But then in the discourses, he said, in a republic, you need to do different things. You need to take greater account of the people. And if he actually had a preference, you can correct me if I'm wrong about any of this, if he actually had a preference, I believe he said that he preferred republics to princes.
He did, yes.
So he was not somebody who advocated scheming and, Mr. Burns rubbing his hands in expectation of gaining wealth or power or anything like that. He was just saying, if that's your situation, then that's what you need to do.
And an evaluation of politics in light of what it is to be human.
Much like Neustadt says, to be a successful president, you need to persuade. Command is a failure. You need to persuade. Machiavelli says if you're going to be a prince, then you need to do these things. So I defend him, but in a very different way from most people.
I agree with you, Dr. Understanding. Yeah. I mean, this sort of is a rather interesting component to it. I mean, part of what people often get caught up in when they're doing sort of the social science part of it is that it becomes harder and harder to account for human nature, which is why I mentioned things like social psychology, or just flatly psychology, sociology, these sorts of things, even anthropology, because getting a sense of what it means to be human is a necessary endeavor for political philosophy. And I'm encouraged by the idea that as behavioralism kind of comes back around to really make headway into that question, because if science really is just studying this thing in a neutral way, then everything you want out of politics, the way you talk about politics, maybe even the reason why you're in political science as a department, how many of you, do any of you actually want to go off and like do social science somewhere, like as political scientists someday? You're not sure? I mean, this becomes an interesting question because a lot of political science discussion is about governments and institutions and how it operates, and you get a little smattering of like methods and research and that sort of stuff, and that's not uncommon for universities. But that means the questions you're asking and the things you're investigating still have with them moral judgments about what is good or what is best. Like slavery's bad, right? That is a moral judgment, a claim about the world that social science can measure, but science itself doesn't answer, right? And yeah, I mean, if we've moved on from Aristotle in many ways, but in some sense, a lot of those questions are still the same to the mystery person on the internet. The questions that Socrates was asking are still questions that we ask today. I mean, what is just? What is fair? What is the good life? What is good society?
We actually have another question from online which says, when it comes to political philosophy, is there a way to separate morals versus fact?
Of course. In sort of like any investigation where you seek the truth, one would separate out morals from fact. The difficulty is that there is no scientist, there is no philosopher who is pure reason in any way. And so we always have to be careful about imparting that in our investigations and the questions we ask and the answers that we seek. And in some sense, unless you are asking for a perfect human being, all philosophy would ask is that you are aware of these tensions, that you constantly try to account for them, which in that sense is no different than what social science is actually asking for, any science, really, in its investigation. The problem is we usually draw moral claims from these things, and in drawing moral claims, we assume that the morality is then therefore the whole of the endeavor, and not it's just end result or a part. In that sense, if you have a moral claim ahead of time and you are trying to reach that conclusion some way, you're kind of doing more theory, less philosophy, because you already know what you want. Instead of trying to figure out what is best or what is good or what is true, you then seek that end or aim. And you just get about it theoretically as opposed to doing it more like quantitatively as you would in social science.
We have another, well, more of a statement, well, it is a statement online, which says, it's individualism according to John Dewey. Does that mean anything?
Hey, what about individualism according to John Dewey? It is individualism?
It is, I don't know. Maybe the answer to the previous question. I don't know if we'll get any clarification here or not, but
I would love a more complete.
That's the statement.
I would love a more complete.
Okay. In the meantime, do we have others? Yeah.
What made you go into this field, and what would you recommend for a student maybe considering it?
What made me go into that? What an interesting question. Yeah, it's going to be something revealing. Since I was an undergraduate, way back when, 40, 50, 60 years ago.
He's joking.
I didn't mean to offend you, Dr. Foley. I always sort of, in the back of my head, I don't know when it eventually struck me, I always kind of wanted to know what it meant to be human. And so for me, the pursuit of political philosophy is generally just a part of philosophy, which includes history, literature, I mean, philosophy as we generally understand it, politics as we generally understand it. And in the end, I think really all that you need is sort of a sense of wonder. I mean, that sounds silly in one way, but classic philosophy always was understood to start in wonder, to wonder about things, to wonder about the world. It just depends on what kind of questions you're asking or what you wish to investigate. For me, I always thought generalities over particulars, was important. Seeking the universal, which led me to a more philosophical question and quest to kind of wonder what the whole is. The problem is in not being able to sort of have answers to these questions. It's possible that if your questions and political questions are better answered by social science, then don't bother with political philosophy, and that's okay too. Because in the end, I know that I will never have answers to a majority, if not all, of the questions that I ask. And I'm satisfied by that, oddly enough, because it's the pursuit of wisdom, which is literally what philosophy is, over necessarily the acquisition of a particular knowledge end or goal. It's to always question it. And so, in some sense, I mean, we have knowledge of some things. It's not like all human beings are just groping in the dark and we're all ignorant of everything, right? But I'm not sort of satisfied by the questions being asked or necessarily the answers being given. I have tended to look towards a broader sense of what it means to be human, which is why I've been drawn to political philosophy, knowing full well it's been relegated to the back of the room in political science departments. But I guess it's just kind of what questions you're asking, Anita, out of the world, and therefore how you want to investigate it. I guess I'm restless in that sense, and that is more akin to philosophy, as Plato put it, almost a kind of madness. What do you ask? What do you have in mind?
I would assume a lot of us have political science majors, or we might be just interested in political science, and just seeing where it took you to get to your field, because I know it's a bit of a specialty. So
didn't used to be, Anita. Didn't used to be. I guess part of the consideration is what kind of questions you want to ask. Because I teach upper division political philosophy courses all the time, and some students are really engaged, and some students stare at me like I'm insane, and some ask the question like, this guy, don't look at me, Tyler, this guy is long dead and gone, why bother? I get it. Part of the activity of political philosophy, though, is to sort of look at it, and principally for me, to look at historically and see the history of political philosophy, and in doing so, investigate these questions along with all those people who for thousands of years have tried to investigate them, Some have more firm answers than others. Some leave it very open-ended in that sense. And part of that investigation is actually intellectually exciting. And that's why I do it. But if you want more concrete answers, if you want to know about like voting outcomes and like legislative processes and stuff, it might not be the best. If you want to talk about the best regime or the best society or what a good citizen is or what it means to be a good person, those are more philosophical questions. Maybe that's more what you'd lean to. I would invite anybody if they want to sit in on any class I teach and find out. There's a few more months in this semester. I got some space, more than happy to.
I already asked kind of about time and how I guess the conclusion there is that we're asking the same questions and maybe the answers are changing. It's like a very brief statement, but how can we at least help to explain like moral differences in the same time period, but not in the same like area of the world? I think especially as Americans, sometimes it's like we're like in our privileges and the rights that we do have. I think sometimes it's hard for us to comprehend that when other nations and other citizens don't have that, and it can be like hard to think about how we have all these at the same time and they don't, but we're living in the same like timeline, if that makes sense.
There's a few different ways that academics, scholars, whatever, have approached these questions. Some of it's just straight up historicism. Everything's in relation to history and time. Cultures are relative. They develop as they will, and therefore they all have different value judgments. Historicists and sometimes social scientists argue, well, values are just values, and one's not better than the other. Let's like measure them, whatever the case may be. Part of what you're asking, though, suggests that in many ways we are more correct than they are.
I don't mean to imply that.
Why don't you mean to imply that? Who's it? Okay.
It was more of a system that was set up for us that we just live in than a system that we decided to actively like set up ourselves.
So when you, this is going to be annoying. I'm going to ask you questions back. When you say a system, what do you mean? Just like a general political structures, or do you mean?
Yeah, I would say general political structures, or like, it's not like we were necessarily born into like the formation of a state or a nation where we're like deciding what we're gonna do. We just kind of landed here.
Yeah, I mean, in some sense, there are a number of social scientists who argue that institutions and laws matter, right? And in doing so, they shape the way people behave, interact, the outcomes of politics, that sort of thing. Cool. Your question seems to dig a little deeper into sort of how do we have our moral underpinnings, what we believe is just or unjust, fair or good. That is a quintessentially political philosophical question. In the end, we could examine history, you could examine political institutions, a number of things, religion, social and moral norms, customs, habits, behaviors. That might get you to the answer of like where we have had differences, but that doesn't necessarily get you to the sense of what is best or good, right? Which is why when you had said these all differ, like why do they differ? There's always sort of this implication that there is better or worse. And if there is, the suggestion that there may be a greatest good, just as there could be an absolute worst. Political philosophy would try to investigate that question to find an answer to that question, even if it fails in doing so. How it would help us investigate one way or another, it may or may not, depending on how you frame the question and in what way. Social science can do a pretty bang-up job of accounting for the history of the processes, the institutions of it, though. But I guess the question resides somewhere in the background. Why do you pick democracy over any other regime type? Like, why? Maybe it's freedom. Maybe that's the answer. Then you have a value judgment. It's value to the social scientist. The political philosopher might ask, is it what's best, or is it the best way to live, or does it make for the best society?
I wanted to ask a little on like what you believe would be like the best regime, like when you're like theorizing about like this sort of thing. Do you look towards more of like a normative kind of like thought process to it, or is it like more empirical? Like, do you look back more at like history, or do you just think like how things I guess like ought to be?
Yes, is an office, I suppose. think I got a little lost in the question once you said, what do I believe? Do you mean like, how should we investigate these questions? Or are you actually asking me what I believe the best regime is?
Yeah, like, well, how do you investigate, like, what you believe is the best regime, if that makes sense?
I'm going to tell you now, I don't have a belief on what the best regime is, because I think that investigation is not yet over. How I would approach the question, generally speaking, is looking at the history of political philosophy, would be looking at history, generally speaking, of the things that arise in literature, because they're expressions of what it means to be human, religion, and religious texts, because even if you're not a believer of any kind, they still order how they think the world is, and therefore how you should behave and operate in it. And all of these things, to sort of the previous question, they affect the way we moralize, organize, our customs, our habits. I don't have a sense of what the best regime is. I think that is yet to be determined. Because even if we're getting lucky and we're headed towards democracy of some kind, aren't we there yet? Probably not. So we still have to ask the questions. What is just? What is unjust? What is fair and good? And we tend to disagree, even if we all deem to want these things. So it is just it's an undertaking, which is why I said before, like, why study political philosophy? Why would you want to do that? It is a kind of madness in some sense, because you may never get that answer. If you're talking about how like a governmental system works, better or worse, and you can like, oh, there's greater efficiency, well, define efficiency, put all the data in, run the numbers, efficiency, right? But then what is the end of that branch of government? What is the end of that bureaucracy? How do you know what is better or worse? Is efficiency simply enough? It seems to be no is the answer. So we'll constantly investigate these questions, of which, again, I think in some sense, I don't know which is the handmaiden to which, but political philosophy and political science have to aid each other in this pursuit. But I do not have a belief on what the best regime is. So
you have like worse. I know, kind of like.
do I have a worse?
Yeah.
These questions. I mean, we tend to. There's a few different ways to think about this. So often we talk about what is best or worst. I think on some level we wish to maximize freedom without sort of detriment to the common good. Asking even what the common good is in and of itself is the question of what the good society is, and it's hard to define. But let's say we value freedom, which I think we generally do. Even Plato, who has been criticized for hating on democracy, still is fully aware that it involves more freedom. Part of the problem is, he said, the aim is not virtue. Do you think virtue and virtuous citizens are important? I would probably say if these are the kinds of qualities that you value, which I think we generally do, we wish for these things in some way, or we see them as essential to a good human life, even if we're not certain of it. Tyranny, where those things are minimized, probably the worst, because tyranny by definition, at least by our definition now, by Aristotle's, I suppose, it means rule that leads to the benefit of the one, not to the common good or the many, which is, even in a good society, most good societies agree on the term that common good is the purpose, end, or aim, not singular good in the form of a tyrant. How that manifests in what different ways, those are just qualities and characteristics that we can just debate over, yeah. A tyranny where there is no mass genocide is probably preferable to a tyranny where there is mass genocide, right? But, you know, it seems easier if we take away those qualities and characteristics of human life when they're removed in whatever form of society, like tyranny, prevents individual flourishing along with flourishing of society as a whole. So it seems to be easier to at least point to the worst. I'm still not sure on the best.
It's a very fluid thing, is it not? I mean, in my American government class, we've talked about conflicting values. We hold all sorts of values, and a lot of them conflict directly with one another. Majority rule and political equality don't always get along. The strict majority rule can strip political rights from the minority, and so. But we value both of them. It just kind of depends upon the ebb and flow of whatever's going on.
And it makes these, not only the questions very challenging, but certainly the answers.
Others? Yeah.
Favorite philosophy or like something that like really like stuck out to you when you read it? Or even like a craziest thought from philosophy that you read?
Craziest thought? Oh my God, I cannot say I've contemplated this sort of thing. There's some that I like to repeat more often to students, because I think they're funny. Like Hobbes says you're all equal by nature, because you're all equally killable. Like you're all just meat, which is awesome. Because students are like, oh, equality, and it sort of dispels that whole thing. As far, because these things are just funny. If you're reading Hobbes and you're not laughing, you're doing it wrong. You can quote me on that. As far as, off the top of my head, I have no great pithy wisdom. And in fact, even if I do, I don't even know if I could attribute to the right persons. I say that because I can never remember a novel that is not in fashion anymore, Lawrence Stern's The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, I think opens up with a quote by Terence. I think it's Terence, or is it Epictetus? Basically, we don't fight over things. I'm paraphrasing. We don't fight over things, we fight over our opinions about things, which is kind of the political problem in and of itself. Objects itself, the way things are, truth we tend not to fight over. This is, there is a young gentleman still, we'll call him, who really is concerned about facts and feelings. We tend not to fight over the facts. It's the actual values we have about them, how we employ them. The feelings part seems to matter for us. Might be Epictetus. See, I already screwed that up, and now in perpetuity it'll be online that I botched that quote. But it does open up The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Stern. Anyway.
The first thing you brought up reminds me of a quote from John Maynard Keynes when people were questioning his notion of active government, Keynesian economics, trying to fight the depression about the long-term effects of all these things. Aren't we doing more harm than good in the long term? And Keynes' response was, in the long term, we're all dead.
True.
In other words, if you wait, it's not going to do any good. You know, now is when we need to do things.
Yeah, I don't know if you said that. Remind me. I think this is a little more popular literature. I think was it Chuck Palahniuk that said every generation wants to be the last, which in and of itself is sort of a funny phrasing. But at some point you have to seize on the moment. One can only project so far into the future. Although I still think we should try. I don't think we should just sort of stop and be the last generation. By the way, I will not be the last generation that'd be like, oh, Gen Alpha, when all the ridiculous things they say, they'll be the last generation. You'll have to fight with them. Yeah, it's sad. Anyway, yeah, I don't have anything pithy to sort of return with.
Others? So what I usually do as we head towards the end of these discussions, I usually ask a sort of future-oriented question. And so I'll just be very broad and say, where are we headed from here? Is political philosophy, is it always there? Does it ebb and flow with other things? I mean, I mentioned before about how political science itself has kind of changed, and changed markedly about 60 years ago in the 1950s and early 1960s to what we know of as today. Is political philosophy just always there in the background, or does it change? Does it evolve?
So I think it has been pushed more and more into the background. They've been, since the rise of behavioralism in like the 1950s and the 60s, right? Political philosophy has basically been considered generally outmoded. And so it no longer works because it is either the subject of thousands of years of non-scientific inquiry, of which much of it is still empirical. It's just not asking the same kinds of questions or investigating the same way. Or it's like based on some sort of ancient cosmology, and therefore, religion, everything we can't have answers for anyway, so don't bother. As behavioralism, as social science has been sort of on the rise, as we believe in the truth that science can bring us, political philosophy sort of disappears in the background, but it doesn't actually, social science doesn't give us the answers. Not only does it not give us the questions, right? It doesn't give us the answers to some of the most fundamental issues in our life. Again, what is just, what is good, what is best, what is noble, what is the best society or regime, because all those questions still beg the questions that we've been asking for thousands of years out of political philosophy. So pushed in the background, I'd probably say yes. But typically, whenever you fight about politics, you're implicitly asking those questions anyway. Will it disappear? I don't think so. God, I hope not. Will it make a return? That I'm not so sure about. In the sort of same force, as long as. But even this is even a concern within social science, because we have been devaluing qualitative analysis just as much as we've been championing quantitative, and more quantitative is better, qualitative worse, even though they are just, first of all, you don't always have the data, right? Qualitative is sometimes the appropriate measure. But if we really want to investigate these things seriously, each has its role, and political philosophy has that role too. Because you're human beings, you're not just bodies in motion, you're not mathematics. And so there are questions that cannot be answered by social science alone. It sort of needs the help of political philosophy. And I'm going to settle on Epictetus, by the way. I think it's Epictetus. That's going to bother me all day. Although someone could fact check me in real time, but you won't. No? You do it in class, but you don't do it here. Charming.
Speaking of real time, Ricardo, do you want to explain your John Dewey quote on here?
I think you just mentioned
Statement?
I think you mentioned
That was you, Ricardo? Thanks a lot, Ricardo.
I was thinking so, but I think earlier when you start the conversation about individualism, Socrates, something along the lines of that.
I don't know if I mentioned individualism, did I?
Behaviorism.
It's been like minutes, so I can't remember. Yeah, behavioralism, certainly. Dr. Cavalli brought up behavioralism. I'm not, when we talk about Dewey, he is constantly interested in building communities and communication between communities so that we can actually have an educated and integrated kind of democracy. Basically, the question after the early 1900s, can we make democracy work? His opponent, Littman, argued basically that our environments are limited, what we can know about them is limited. And so in that sense, you need those who can know, kind of, in a certain sense, experts who would help inform politicians, which is something we tacitly desire, even if we don't want them to run politics. Dewey is actually hoping that as people become publics, or those affected in political and public spaces, you can actually build communities through education and communication. Individualism becomes a problem because it focuses solely on the individual, and it negates this sense of community. Dewey also is pretty adamant about when you pretend you're all individuals as if you're somehow not connected to society and engaging with one another, which he says is a farce. The concept, the ideology of individualism sort of pushed to its extreme. You are not absent a society, you are constantly integrated with it one way or another. So, but I'm not exactly sure what you had in mind or what I said. 30, I don't know how long I've been here for, however many minutes ago, Ricardo. So,
These are timestamps, so you can check later on.
okay. When I fight over like quotes and everything else like that, oh man. So I don't know, Ricardo, but I can certainly in the future answer your question once I sort of review the footage. Okay, we can do that.
Your discussion, a little bit off topic, but it is kind of related, reminds me of this sort of modern debate in baseball going on between sort of old school experience and just knowing what works and what doesn't, and the new Moneyball using statistics and sabermetrics and metric measurements, et cetera, et cetera. There are lots of people now. I mean, that was the big thing 20 years ago, is moving towards this statistical analysis in baseball. And now you get a lot of people more and more saying, well, that stuff's all garbage. It doesn't really tell you, or if it does tell you anything, it tells you the same thing that the old school, managers and coaches just used to know by intuition, who's the good and who's the bad, and you can actually ruin players by overanalyzing them and over getting too involved in statistics and metrics.
Dr. Cavalli, I don't know about baseball for that to be fully relevant to me, but I think I get the sense of what you are sort of saying, right? It becomes rather difficult because, right, what social science can do really well is measure things in the aggregate. If there's a lot of something, we can account for it, measure it in some way or another, put a number to it. It doesn't do well in sort of explaining the individual or individual behavior. We're a lot worse at that, which is why I still think there's space for qualitative analysis, qualitative data, and that sort of work. Just as much as I would imagine even in baseball. Right? One could run the numbers, look for the statistics, but still at some point think about, or at least return to individual sort of experiences.
I mean, there was a period of time in my life when I was in graduate school 100 years ago, when I saw the value of statistics and, data and measurements, and it's the theory of instrument. You learn how to do this, and suddenly you start seeing things you can measure and develop correlations and do regression analyses all over the place. But then later on in life, I start to see the value of not necessarily doing that. And actually, that reminds me of a debate that went on in political science itself right around 2000. When I used to teach the senior seminar, I had saved a copy of a letter that was written to the American Political Science Review about how it and political science had become really divorced from reality. That most articles looked more like mathematical articles rather than political science. And are we really helping people when we're producing these studies and data, et cetera, that are again look more like the output of a computer gone crazy than anything that people can really use? And it was that debate right around the year 2000 that led to what's the other publication? Perspectives in Politics, that they now put out, which is devoted more to theory, more to case study, more to more approachable things. And so I wish I had thought about that earlier here, because that was a sort of a second debate that political science had with itself. First was that development of the new behavioralism, and then this sort of return to a more, what would you call it, a more human perspective, maybe?
I suppose, yeah, I mean, in the end, it's sort of funny, right? Because social science can do a lot of work, but it can't define the goals per se. Human beings define the goals. And so one could easily see any science, social science, sort of lose itself in the idea of measuring and discovering to try to seek genuine knowledge, the truth about something, right, but then in losing what the whole purpose of politics is for a better society, a better life, the best regime possibly, or the best kind of person, citizen, whatever that may look like.
I mean, I remember, I'm married to an English professor here, Dr. Robinson, and I remember when I was new here, and she was new here, I was still enamored with statistics. I was the stats guy in the department. They got the license for SPSS for me, so I could crunch out numbers. And I remember talking to her about doing statistical content analyses of Shakespearean literature, counting the words and categorizing the themes in the words, and really being taken by that. I mean, legitimately being taken by what we could learn by that kind of stuff. And that doesn't hold much of an attraction to me anymore.
It's funny you mention that. When I was getting my doctorate however long ago, there was a professor who very much into quantitative analysis. And in doing so, she posited something similar. She said, well, why don't you just take one of these books, do like a word search, and count for the number of this times this word appears or that word appears. And it was very difficult to explain to her that sometimes the absence of a word or its infrequency is actually more important than its frequency. What its context and how we talk about it matters, not just simply of counting it or measuring it. And some things just do not do well under rigorous quantitative analysis.
Yeah, I think there's a place for each. There is a place
Certainly.
for this sort of statistical content analysis, even of written material.
Oh yes, I
even of
wasn't trying
poetry.
to cast out the whole thing.
But that's not the be-all and end-all. And
Right.
it's good to sort of, to put it, for lack of a better way to put it, to keep your options open.
Yeah, I mean, if we're trying to investigate the nature of all things, it's best to find as many avenues to that truth, should it be there, as possible. I think that's true.
Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for Also, we will be continuing to do more events throughout the semester, so if you want to keep up with us, we're UNG PSSA on Instagram, and we also have a group me, so you can reach out and join that as well.
Is that that's the QR code for
Yes.
the group me if you want to join the group me discussion? Right there. Somewhere there's a sign-up sheet for attendance. If you haven't signed up, please go ahead and do that and put a faculty name. We meet here every Wednesday at noon, so we'll see you next week.
I don't, I hate it, but I needed to ask, so I did it.
Thank you.
For some reason, it's not the right person to ask.